And really, I think what's going to be sort of the major, the next revolution in urban transportation, which is going to be the primacy of information. We're reaching the point where the information for modes of any mode of transit is more important than the mode itself. And how that information is used, shared, networked together, managed, is going to lead to all sorts of new sort of flexible meshes of transportation. I think that will be different than anything we've ever seen in cities. And so it's interesting to me, we'll go through introductions here before getting into some early questions. So on my immediate left here is Don Butler, who's the Executive Director of Connected Vehicles and Services at Ford. He's the one responsible for those beautiful cars parked on the lawn. To his immediate left is Jeff Olson, who's the principal at Alta Planning and Design, the folks who basically produce most of the bike-sharing systems you know and love. To his immediate left is Shiva Kumar, who's the CEO and co-founder of Urban Engines, which is one of the companies that are doing a lot with that sort of transit data, as I mentioned. And then finally at the end is Zia Yusuf, who is the CEO and president of Streetline, which is doing some interesting stuff in basically what we call connected parking. So without much further ado in our introductions, I want to start getting into some of the nitty-gritty around sort of the future of transportation. I think, befitting Detroit and David's introduction, the first question is for Don, really, about sort of where the car is headed. I mean, it's been the dominant form of mobility in the United States for a century. It's really, I think this year is the anniversary among many of Henry Ford perfecting the assembly line as we know it and really ushering in the age of the Model T in mass production. And so the first question I have, Don, is I was hoping you could talk a bit about, as someone who's new in the post here of running connected vehicles at Ford, about, I guess, sort of Ford's vision of the car. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now around the car in the sense of, I think it's interesting that the two companies that are doing the most right now to get people excited about cars again are not automakers. I would say it's Google and Uber. One of which is trying to disrupt the automakers, arguably, if it actually intends to fully mass produce its own autonomous car. The other one of which, of course, treats cars as simply another bit of information and a service to be provided. So in light of that, how does Ford make people excited about owning their own car again and driving their own car again? And what is this sort of, this car as digital platform going to look like?
Sure. Well, it really all goes back to, as you mentioned, Henry Ford, his vision of opening all highways for mankind. And that vision has obviously largely come to pass with over 1 billion vehicles on the road globally today. As we go forward in the future, his great-great-grandson, Bill Ford, our chairman, has broadened that definition to talk about mobility and mobility solutions. And so we view the vehicle as part of that mobility solution, that mobility fabric. We certainly intend to satisfy those folks that would like to own a vehicle as a personal mode of transportation, and that will continue to be something that we build upon. And one of the ways that we do that is we make our vehicles more attractive in the sense of leveraging connectivity. And what I mean when I say connectivity, there's really 3 different forms. There's beamed in, there's brought in, and then there's built in. Beamed in connectivity, ever since we've had AM radios, there's been beamed in connectivity, if you will. The ability to attach yourself to the outside world or get information from the outside world. Brought in connectivity, that's leveraging a smart device, for instance, that you might bring into the vehicle. And with our sync system, we've established a lead there in terms of enabling people to interact with that device, the content on the device, the contacts on the device, the communication capability of that device, and enabling them to interact with it in a seamless way, eyes on the road, hands on the wheel. And then finally, there's built-in connectivity, the vehicle itself as a network on the node, this increasing presence of the Internet of Things, and the vehicle as a smart computing connected platform, sharing information, gathering information, being able to be updated remotely. And so we leverage connectivity to make our vehicles more attractive, and I think we can talk about some interesting things that are possibilities as we look at the vehicle as one piece of that mobility utility and mobility fabric, and how we can leverage connectivity to make that happen as well.
Great. Well, just to follow up on that, so you mentioned beforehand that your previous gig was at Cadillac, which just recently said that they intend to have at least some limited form of hands-free autonomy by 2016, which I think is ahead of even, Nissan is on the record saying they're going to have their first autonomous car by 2020. So what's Ford perspective on the autonomous car? What's the realistic time frame?
Well, when you talk about autonomous vehicles, you have to understand when you say autonomous, what do you mean? There's various levels.
4 levels.
There's 4 different levels, and we don't have time to get into the distinctions between each of them, but it basically goes from assisted to totally unassisted without the driver being involved at all, which is kind of where Google is leading, no steering wheel at all in the vehicle. And from a Ford perspective, we believe that the driver should always be engaged if not actively in the driving experience, aware of what's going on. And so the way that we look at it is we are on a path towards autonomous driving with things like lane keeping assist systems, with things like adaptive cruise control, with things like perpendicular parking and parallel parking automatically, which hopefully you've had a chance to experience in our vehicles. We believe that there will be an involvement of technology, but at the same time, as should be readily apparent, there are legal implications, there are societal implications. When you think about the ethics of driverless vehicles, what does that mean? If a vehicle has to make a decision about what's the least impactful accident to have, if I have to have an accident, how do you really get into the machine ethics of that, as it were? So there's a lot that needs to take place before we get to the point that we have completely autonomous. Certainly we're on the path as well in terms of increasingly driver-assisted systems, things like traffic jam assist, for instance, which will be coming out shortly from Ford. So we're on that same path as other companies, but we're hesitant to say a vehicle will be completely autonomous within any specific time frame because there's so many other pieces of the puzzle that have to come together first.
Yeah, great. Well, Jeff, skipping from cars to bikes while focusing on modes, since we actually have the transportation modes on this side and the information folks on the other. Jeff, Alta, of course, is like basically the leading provider of bike sharing as we know it. Divvy in Chicago, being I think one of the leading examples. And I promised Jeff I would note as a Fast Company writer that they're one of our 50 most innovative companies in business, the Alta folks. But I guess my question is where's bike sharing the revolution headed next? Because I mean it's been I think less than a decade since Paris Philippe really sort of implemented the first modern system. No one actually thought in the United States that bike sharing would take off the way it has. And groups like C40, some of the cities' initiatives, have really sort of made an effort to turn bike sharing into a best practice. So, I guess my question, as a sort of a short question, is what are the sort of best practices we've learned from bike sharing so far? And how would you implement a bike sharing program in Detroit, given its size? I mean, and the lack of a really concentrated public transit system here, which cities like Washington, D.C. have benefited from, where people are using bikes as the last mile from major transit stops. So how do you apply it to something at the scale of Detroit?
It's a great series of questions, and thanks to Fast Company for the honor. We really think mobility, as just mentioned a second ago by Don, is a symbol. The bike is a symbol of how we'll be mobile in the future. It's one of many mode choices that people can make. Bike sharing makes that choice easier to do and more often. When you ask about that state of the practice, we've just passed through 25 million rides with 0 fatalities, more than 1 billion calories burned, tens of millions of miles traveled, and that's something that a lot of people 5 years ago said would never happen. If you get a chance, go look at The Daily Show and their great episode, Full Pedal Racket, and really it's one of the funniest pieces they've done. And you just look back to that short time ago when people said this wouldn't be successful, and it's been, I think, very, very successful, and not just in New York, but in Toronto, in San Francisco, Chicago, New York City, Boston, Melbourne, and it's happening in cities around the world. Mexico City was just on the panel a moment ago. So I think that state of the practice is evolving very quickly. Solar-powered, Wi-Fi-enabled technology, stations that are fully movable. We're seeing probably 20 different innovations in the technology realm of how that's going to work. And cities are getting very sophisticated about providing that future infrastructure, which is different than the cities we've had before. And I think the question becomes, when we move in the city of the future, where do we want to go? How do we want to get there? How does our experience of the day in that city interact, whether it's with motor vehicles, bicycles, or walking? Those are all important aspects of that practice. So the question about Detroit, I want to thank Wayne State. We did a feasibility study here with the campus and the city looking at the future of bike sharing here in Detroit. There's tremendous opportunities for possibly manufacturing. This campus right here has just started its own on-campus bike share. And this is just something that's becoming one of the must-haves for cities around the world. It is not the solution to every problem, but it's a good solution to a lot of things. And it's one that we can afford to do, that can be made to work, the infrastructure we know how to design and build, and hopefully we'll be seeing a lot more of it.
Great, thank you, Jeff. I want to skip over to Zia to discuss Streetline and parking, which of course is one of the great resource conundrums of cities. This massive public good, the streetscape, which is often either either essentially parking is too cheap, and essentially the city is giving away the good, or in many cases parking is too rare, and then you basically have increased carbon emissions because drivers are constantly circling blocks. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about, before we get to Shiva and really talking about sort of the urban engines and sort of how this all comes together, but talk about sort of, I guess, sort of the parking piece of the puzzle and sort of the first steps towards, really embedding sensors in the environment for aiding transit.
You surprised me. You thought you were going to go this way. So I was like, oh my God, I have to actually
Got to stay on your toes up here.
think about this now. Look, thanks for the invitation. It's interesting. Cars only do two things. They either drive or they park. For most of our modern history, we've ignored the parking piece of it, right? No. So much effort has been focused on the traffic angle of it. It takes you 14.2 minutes to get from point A to point B. The problem is point B is not your destination. Your real destination is point C when you park the car. And there was so much kind of technological advancement in mobile phones, certainly on the sensor side. It seemed strange that we weren't using these new technologies to solve this very basic problem for consumers, as well as for cities. I mean, for cities, this is a massive real estate play. Right? It's a piece of real estate that's not priced appropriately, it's not allocated appropriately. You have huge spikes of demand in certain areas and you're paying 50 cents an hour, and 3 blocks over, there's nobody there and you're still paying 50 cents an hour. So it's not like I grew up saying I want to be in the parking industry, but I am. Hey, don't laugh, it's very important. Good. And it's been a fascinating journey. So it's estimated that 25 to 30% of the traffic in a city is caused by people looking for parking. And that's a huge number. And maybe it's off by 10%. So make it 20%. That's still a huge number. And so what Streetline does is we go and put out these sensors in the ground in each parking spot. There's a mesh network. And then there's 7 different apps that sit on top of it. There's apps for consumers that guide you to an open parking spot in real time. There's analytics information for the city to really look at the policy in a certain area, the pricing in a certain area. Los Angeles is now doing dynamic pricing, and if you look at our app, it will show you that it's $1 per hour here, and it may be up to $6 per hour in another block. So when you have such a scarce resource, you need pricing in order to take care of it. The sensors are an important piece of it, but it's the data and the applications that sit on top that's important. We just announced a deal with Cisco where we're starting to use cameras in order to extend the detection capability. At some point, if cars get specific enough that they can give us that data, we'd love to use that. If the brain trust that Shiva has can able to do it without the sensors, we'll be open for that as well. So it's about rethinking something that impacts everybody who has a car in a fundamentally different way. And there's no reason why you should pay for a parking spot. Maybe the Starbucks or the restaurant, you walk in, you ask them what spot are you, and you say spot 36, they pay for parking, you're done. So there's all kinds of things around reservations and so on and so forth that we can think about. And I think we're in 40 different locations now. You can find the parking in a couple of minutes instead of the 10, 15 minutes. So it's just very exciting how much innovation is taking place in transportation through information and through technology. And full disclosure, Bill Ford is an investor in Streetline.
Okay. So mobility solutions.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, this is a good setup then for Shiva to talk about this, because this is Urban Engines, is my understanding, is really sort of in the business of taking all this data. So that's my question for you, Shiva, is really, what is the end game for cities and for the actors in cities where we're collecting all this data from parking, from cars, from bike sharing stations, and from of course, the phones and our GPS, and soon to be our Apple Watches, with sensor data and GPS and Foursquare and all these other sorts of instrumenting the urban environment is. What can we do with it? How are we going to use this? Because it strikes me as the discussion around Detroit, as David pointed out, there's no mass transit from the airport. Detroit is the largest city in America with no actual sort of rail public transit grid. But really, it strikes me as we have an opportunity to create a much more flexible form of transit collected from everything. So how do we go about building that? How do we build that engine?
Yeah, so as Don was saying, there's a lot of data coming in from cars, lots of data coming in from buses, from mass transit, from smart cards, from smartphones, from parking sensors.
I'll sell it to you. It's done.
There's a lot of data coming in from all these different places. And the reality is that a lot of this data is siloed, and it's piecemeal in some way. And but we sort of view this as a big jigsaw puzzle. If you actually can put these pieces together, then you actually can figure out pretty much exactly how people, what people's choices are. How do they want to use the city? What are the places they'd like to go to? Where they like to go to work? Where they want to go to play? Where they want to buy? So you can sort of figure out what are the key behaviors of the commuting population at large. And from that, you can start figuring out how responsive is the underlying infrastructure going to be to respond to these kinds of demands. How does the city grow? How does it change over time? What are the spaces that are being used? And what are the spaces that are not as being actively used? So a lot of those things are certainly, when you put this jigsaw puzzle together, can figure out, can I improve the commute tomorrow? What happens when there's an event going on? What happens when it's raining or it's snowing? And how does the city evolve in the next 20 years? Where do I put my next sort of residential complexes? Where should I build my next sort of office complexes? Where should I put retail? So all those kinds of longer-term planning questions are also possible now that we have all this data being collected and can be sort of analyzed and given a unified view of the city, the pulse of the city.
Well, that gets the question. So here's a question for any of you to take, or how you imagine this. What is the end game of all these revolutions? So for example, this is something I was having breakfast this morning with the attorney who represents Lyft here in Detroit. The entry of Uber and Lyft. And the people I've spoken to has been hailed as a great thing because of the limited taxi services and the limited public transportation. And one of the things that came up in our discussion this morning was how seamless the Uber and Lyft interfaces are. It's an app that comes to you. So, with Urban Engine perhaps powering the system below, and the fact that some people want to have an Uber that arrives at their doorstep or an autonomous car, and some people want to drive. What is the end game? Are we going to have a seamless service where I'm going to basically say, I want to go to the nearest bike sharing station, or I want a car that's going to take me from A to B? How do you imagine this sort of mobility mesh evolving? What will it look like? How will I use it? How will people in Detroit use it? And who owns it? Is it a private service? Is it a public service? Is it something Ford wants to get into as part of its mobility, for example?
I don't know that I have a complete answer, but we know that within this space, it's going to require partnerships. No one entity is going to be able to develop a complete and total solution. And so we'll need to understand what are the auspices and what are the, if you will, virtual APIs under which we'll share data on an aggregated basis in order to make better decisions. We'll need to understand how to help consumers enable and live the experiences that they want to live. And increasingly, it's going to be tailored and contextual for exactly what people are doing within that particular phase of their life and that particular phase of their day. So two things, I would say. Partnerships are going to be required, and then we need a way to share that data while protecting our consumers' ability to remain anonymous, but also sharing it in a way that provides value.
I was going to jump in and say there's some bigger picture questions that, again, if mobility provides us for access to communities we want to be in, we need to be healthy. We need to have an environment that's better for the next generation. We need to make sure that we can afford the modes of travel that we choose and that they're supporting our economic conditions. So it's really, how do we get to that point? Can our children walk or ride their bicycles to school? Can our seniors live in place in neighborhoods that are safe for them to simply get around as we age in place? Those are sort of basic fundamentals. And if you look at the infrastructure the United States primarily has been building for the last 50 years, we've left a lot of gaps, right? Other countries and other places have been much more successful in becoming more mobile and using less energy to be able to do so. I would argue that continuum from walking to bicycling to shared transit to transit all the way up to air travel and maybe space travel by the time we get there. We need to provide that, and they need to be interconnected in ways that we haven't quite figured out yet. So I think that's the end game, is that your daily life will be better, that will make the world a better place, and that the things we're working on help us to get there.
I think the future is completely multimodal. I think we all believe that. So on the demand side, I think people are going to have a unified experience, whether it's jumping on your bike to get to the local train station and taking a train from one city to another, and then going from there to the last mile through a ride-sharing program. I think that's kind of a no-brainer from a demand perspective. On the supply side, I think there's a lot of opportunities as well, because if you actually truly understand what people's behaviors are and what their patterns of movement are, can I now look at my fleets and just optimize that a lot better, right? Can I If I notice that the trains are running packed, can I run bus services that are express services that can capture some of the demand and be much more responsive? If it's raining, we've been analyzing billions of commutes across the world, and it's fascinating to see people's behavior changes, even if it's raining lightly versus heavily, or versus snowing. People tend to jump on different modes of transportation just from a convenience perspective. So if you sort of understand those kind of macro patterns from a supply and from a demand perspective, I think the commuting experience is just going to keep getting faster and better and more personalized.
I guess the only comment I would make is timing is a big factor in all of this, right? What's the time horizon you're talking about? I think I agree from a demand perspective, the demand to have an integrated multimodal system is there. I think the US in particular, but also certainly Europe and other parts of the world, are much more challenged on the supply side. So you can have a pocket of bike share, or I mean, if you look at California, public transportation, horrible, and so on and so forth. I think the automobile is still going to be central to what we do for many years to come. Even if you look at the cities of Europe, where admittedly they're much more advanced on the public transportation side, even cities like Amsterdam or Paris and so on, the gridlock created by cars, the demand for cars continues to grow. So there's a little bit of a kind of separation between the hopes and dreams and what's actually happening in terms of the reality. And especially in emerging markets, whether it's China or India, I mean, the car is still very much that symbol. So it's a different situation there. So this will take decades, if not longer than that, to manifest itself. And the question is, what do we do in the interim to solve these problems to actually improve people's lives?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, and again, perhaps if any of you want to take this, but considering we're in Detroit, I mean, this is a city, of course, that was molded by the car. This is really arguably, this and Los Angeles, the two cities that were, the entire urban form was shaped by the automobile, truly, in many ways. And so, you know, I think a lot of the discussion about sort of this mobility mesh or mobility as a service, as Jeff pointed out, has tremendous implications for land use and how we access cities. How do we redesign the urban fabric? And I was curious if anybody has any thoughts on sort of how that will actually occur, or, you know, is this going to be good for cities, or will we see further dispersal? This is a debate we're having at NYU right now about whether the autonomous car will be very good for dense cities, or will it lead to incredible exurban sprawl because now you can sleep during your commute. So I don't know. I guess my question is, you know, what is a scenario? You know, I should just note here that at NYU we're finishing up these scenarios, and we imagine a sort of LA of 2025, where if you have all sorts of incompatible autonomous car operating systems, you end up with hellacious gridlock, where people basically get home at 10 o'clock at night and leave their kids sleeping in the back seat before they start their commute at 4 a.m. You know, end up with Legos if you do it wrong. But I was hoping, you know, perhaps you could talk a bit about, I guess, what is an imagined scenario for Detroit in, say, 2020, where we have some autonomous cars, where we have a bike-sharing network? Does anyone want to talk about, I guess, sort of what neighborhoods would benefit from this from the most? What kind of urban environments would benefit from this from the most?
I'd be happy to start with that.
Please do.
And I think that we're seeing some really innovative urban form work happening all over the world right now. The idea of urban greenways is something that, you know, the idea has been around for a long time, but it's happening at a rapidly increasing rate. The idea that these natural corridors that have mobility in them, primarily for human power, are becoming integrated into neighborhood design and redevelopment projects. Detroit has a fantastic, the Southeast Michigan Greenways program, if you're not familiar with it, was one of our favorites, and thanks to many of the people here who are making that happen. And that brings about a very significant change, the idea that what we consider the built environment, cities, and what we consider nature start to become connected in ways that, you know, maybe the best models in the past were things like Central Park or urban parkways, and that landform is something that really is kind of unique, and that's happening globally right now. So that's one example where how we use the public space that exists in cities, much of it which is used for storing vehicles or moving them, is now shifting to very different kinds of purposes, and that ties to that more optimistic view of the future, right? And I think if we don't have that, if you've seen the movie WALL-E, and we're going to end up in these recliner chairs with the Slurpee drinks, and our health is going to decline, and our safety is going to decline, then we're not heading in that positive direction. So I'm an optimist. I believe the glass is half full, and it's half full of something we really like to drink. So
I can imagine a scenario in the not too distant future with the M1 rail project and being able to link things up along Woodward. One of our challenges in the Detroit area is I've looked at it, is we have these kind of pockets of goodness, but they're disconnected, right? You've got the cultural center here around Wayne State. You've got the Fox Theater District and the stadiums, and then you've got downtown along Jefferson. But it's, people would come to one area and then just leave. And so if there's an ability to, for instance, bring my electric vehicle to the N1 rail station and plug it in and it's being charged, and I know on my app that the rail station is going to be running for this amount of time, and so I visit here initially, but then I go to the Fox Theater District, and then I go all the way down to the riverfront, and then I go back to my vehicle. I think it will be a huge benefit and a huge boom from an economic standpoint. I think there'll be this opportunity for people to get to enjoy a city that is living and breathing and alive, as opposed to just coming to one spot and then leaving again and not really getting a total picture. That's in the not too distant future, 4 or 5 years from now.
Great. All right, one more question, then we're going to open it up to the audience here, because I'm sure you have all sorts of questions as well. But I want to come back to Shiva and Zia for a moment here, considering that you both work closely with cities in your work. And one of the interesting things about this, about how this sort of, this new mobility will happen is will it be a publicly led or privately led? So for example, I think of Helsinki right now as, of course, trying to build exactly the sort of mesh, and the city is taking the lead in this. They want to build their own app and their own service. And Seoul has banned Uber, for example, and they want to build their own app as well. But I think it's interesting here in the United States that public transit is something led by the cities, and parking is something provisioned by the cities. But the most success we've had in sort of ride sharing has been led by private companies, Uber kicking in regulatory doors. So I'm curious for the two of you, and I hope you guys will jump in. Do you think this is going to be a publicly led revolution or a privately led revolution? How do you think this will shake out in terms of how we'll use this, as a public good or as a private members only service?
It's a very simple answer. It's a combination. There's no other answer to that, and it will. I think the most interesting level of government where innovation is happening. I mean, I would hate to be president. I'd love to be a city mayor today. Yeah, okay. And
I think you still probably have a better role in most cases.
But it's the amount, the opportunity to change people's lives at the city level today with all the technology that's available, not just in transportation, but in other areas, is pretty tremendous. In the work that we do, I mean, the cities aren't going to go build these technologies and these apps. They own the spaces, they own the streets. For us, the biggest hope is to find heads of transportation, mayors, city managers that are innovative, that are looking at things differently, that are not kind of wedded to the status quo. So as long as we have a partner on the other side, and we do it in Los Angeles, in Boston, in Indianapolis, and so on, it makes for, I think you can create incredible value, both for the public sector side as well as the private side. So it has to be a combination. And even in the case of Uber, I mean, ultimately it's a negotiation between the city and Uber, and they come to an agreement. And so it has to take it from there.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what Zia was saying. I mean, fundamentally, cities want to be more sustainable, and they want to be more attractive for people to move in. And so a lot of the folks that we have been interacting with have exactly the same goals, right? So they are very strong on the policy side, have a really good sense of what the pulse of the local population looks like. What we offer is on the technology side. So when there's huge amounts of disparate data sources, when the challenge of putting the jigsaw puzzle together is a big one. So that's how we play into this. And our excitement is that can we offer the best quality tools so they can make these decisions about how to improve their own commuter lives next week, next year, and 20 years from now.
Great. Well, any questions from the audience? We have 2 mics down here, so come on down. I think we have someone on this side. Please go ahead. Hi there. Please identify yourself, too.
My name is Jeff Antanic. I work with Plant Moran, which is a local accounting and consulting firm. And I'm really excited about a lot of the driverless vehicle. Certainly, I think it's a boon for commerce, but as probably one of the older people here, I'm looking forward to the day that I don't have to worry about my kids taking my car keys away. I will have a driverless vehicle. But I think, Jeff, you might have mentioned it, or someone mentioned the idea of interoperability. And we in the United States don't really have a great track record of playing together well. As somebody from the cellular industry, we have A and B carriers, and we're so much further behind than Europe. What should we be doing now to start to head off the problems that we could face with interoperability in these issues?
Well, one of the ways that we're addressing it from a Ford standpoint is through leveraging an open source technology that we call Smart Device Link. And that's a way of connecting with and interacting with information on the vehicle and controls on the vehicle In fact, it's interesting, you talk about LA. We recently had a very first, actually, automotive developers conference, and we brought together a number of developers, and we provided them with access to vehicle data. The city of Los Angeles also graciously supplied a huge data set that consisted of things like traffic flow patterns, construction planning, urban transit kinds of data sets as well. And the idea is just to mash all that together to develop solutions that we couldn't think of before. And so, but the way that that was enabled was through this open platform called Smart Device Link and being able to access the data that's on the vehicle. So one of the ways that we need to do it is, again, as I talked about before, ways of facilitating exchanging data through APIs and frameworks that make sense and can cross boundaries.
If I may jump in. I mean, I think this is a fascinating question. In my house, I have a lot of iOS devices, and so it's very hard to introduce an Android device into the mix. So now I'm actually worried about the day when I have to worry if I'm buying an Android car or an iOS car, and how they'll, even from just playing my music and my video. So I think the connectedness issue across these multiple OSs as they will evolve is going to be pretty fascinating.
Great. Question over here, please.
Hi, Chris Hines, Smith Group, JGR. There's a lack of transportation, public transportation in this city that we've talked about, and I think there's a big perception that the big three killed mass transit in Detroit. And now that we're sort of moving past that, how can we sort of mend fences to look at public transportation not as competition, but to work collaboratively with the auto industry?
If I can jump in there, not having been personally offended because I wasn't around.
I was going to duck.
In fact, we are very much supporters and sponsors of the M1 Rail project, for instance, and we view public transportation as one of those modes that absolutely needs to be developed, and it needs to be developed in Detroit. And we view the automobile, again, as part of the solution. Again, there will be people that will want to own a vehicle for the pleasure of what that means and for the symbolism of what it means. And as we go forward in the future, there'll be people that will want a time slice of a particular vehicle for a particular moment in time, and then they're going to go to a bike or they're going to go to a bus. And so we're going to be part of that ecosystem and part of that fabric, definitely.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Judy Baldasancho. I am a physical therapist by profession. This is going to be my 24th year. When I founded my company, it's called Health and Ideas. I originally would just be teaching, because that's my forte, right? But I'm very interested in public health. So I ended up going to the World Confederation of Physical Therapy in Amsterdam 3 years ago. And I do have I'm very social, so I do have a lot of like architects and whatever. I became very interested in green technology. Dan Gilbert last year had this program, Redesigning Detroit. I ended up joining that thing. I'm on the 20 percentile, but nothing came. Well, I know it's, any change will come in so many years.
Your question, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm glad that you guys are really collaborating, and I know that Emerald is happening. What is the immediate timetable for this to take place now? Like in 5 years, in 3 years? Because we talked about 2020 or 2050, but a lot of times if people don't see change, they don't buy into it. They're like, hooray, and then nothing happens, and then people retreat back. So is there a little bit more concrete plans for that?
Thank you. I would like to hear an answer to this from Jeff, because it strikes me that with the M1, that this is where bike sharing stations all along the route could really extend its impact tremendously. That's my own thought. But
I used to have a sign in my office is that it's cheap, it's easy, and it works. And one of the things that mayors and leaders in communities have seen about not just bike share, but also pedestrian, bike, and urban trail infrastructure, it's pretty quick to do on the big scheme of things. It's a lot easier than putting in a big light rail line or building bridges and tunnels. And it is the kind of work that, with the right team of people in a community, can be made to happen fairly quickly. So I think to answer the question was just asked, these are things we can get done in a single mayor's term, within a corporate leader's role in office, within a university campus or other sites. If there's the willingness to do it, the resources to get it done, and it's one of these 1% investments that yields 10% results. So that's the popularity of it is largely being driven by, of all the things that we have had to do in a very tough economy in the last several years, we've been able to get this done in so many places because it is cheap, it's easy, and it works.
Question?
Yeah, my name is Zenon Kuzman. I work for IHS Automotive, and actually my question kind of dovetails with the last answer. I'm seeing large mobility projects in a lot of cities around the country, and to me, as a Midwestern guy, it seems like it's easier to finance and mobilize these projects in places like Boston and Portland. It's harder to conceptualize these things happening in places like Dallas and Phoenix. And I'm wondering if there are different political and public support models and approaches being used in different cities, because I'm thinking it's a harder sell in places like Dallas and Phoenix in those types of political environments.
Anyone? Anyone's worked with cities there?
I took the last one.
I wonder if universities in some of these places might be the catalyst for growing smarter mobility solutions in those areas. I mean, I hear that, at least in Detroit, that the Ann Arbor campus actually has really good transportation. So people actually end up driving there, but in the last few miles, it's actually really good transportation. So I'm wondering if, and this is true in many other universities across the U.S. as well. So I'm wondering if in places like Phoenix and Dallas, if the local universities might be the hotspots from which you can start growing out these solutions.
Does that answer your question?
Well, one answer I got talking amongst my colleagues is Phoenix wants high-speed rail because they're growing quickly and they're in a basin like LA is, and their only way to grow is to solve a transportation problem, but still it's a politically conservative place that minimizes the role of government. So I'm just not sure how they frame that public-private partnership. It's just a very curious issue of how that's sold culturally. And
So just, this is not going to answer your question, but what the hell? It's
But you want to run for mayor?
I love when we get that caveat right up front. So go ahead, please.
practice. I think one of the interesting things to look at is building infrastructure the right answer to solving transportation problems. In some cases, it clearly is in the case of the public. But in other cases, in my business and what Uber is doing, for example, it's an information gap. It's not an infrastructure gap. And if you look at parking, when people say, oh my God, there's no parking, let's build a new parking lot, is because they went to an intersection and they took a left instead of taking a right. If they'd taken a right, they would have found parking. And so it's clearly not the answer for everything, but I think there is a way that information and data can help solve people's individual transportation problems. And of course, physical infrastructure is part of that, but I don't think it's every answer.
I'm sure the conversation is going to be going around when we speak next year. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, are there any other questions? In that case, we're in our final ticking down of seconds, so I'll stop there.